Gundur gazed out upon the dank and dark waters of the grey flood and scowled. He hated this place. His mind wandered to the days of his youth in Dunland. He could almost feel the crisp mountain air on his face as he slipped deeper into thought. He recalled the scent of fresh pine caught on the wind, and the sounds of gentle rivers and grazing livestock. Home. It had been too long since he last saw the rolling hills of Dunland, and he found an anger building inside of him. Dragged from his home on the promises of glory and riches, the White Hand had pushed many of his friends further west, and he was no different. The embers of his anger broke his stupor, and the humidity of the place hit him like a wall. He would never get used to the constant sweating, the heavy breathing, gasping for air, and filling your lungs with nothing but heat. He hated this place. The sun was rising high above him and casting its light across the waters of the Grey Flood and Swan Fleet. The quagmire where the rivers met was abuzz with the sounds of insects and beasts, and Gundur could practically smell that place from his watchpost above the northern gate. His attention was suddenly caught by a bright flash of light on the road from the north, a shape moving on southward and dazzling him as it approached. Straining, he saw it was an outrider, hurtling along the road at full pace. Gundur wasted no time and blew a loud, clear note on the horn around his neck. The low sound of insects and frogs was broken by the mustering of men at the gate. A second horn blast answered his own from within the city behind him, and the great northern gate of Tharbad swung open. A column of dour, heavily armed men marched from the gate and out into the field beyond. Behind them, looking as forlorn as he always did, came Chieftain Ninaean. Gundur could not help but feel that someone else should hold that man's position. He looked long over the form of his chieftain and spat in disgust. The man was a thin strip of nothing, and Gundur often thought a strong breeze would likely blow him over. Ninaean walked with a sense of superiority and pride that he had certainly not earned, and he spoke to his subjects always with scorn. He blamed the recent misfortunes of Dunland on his own people, and did not own up to his part in the downfall. When Dunlarac was besieged by an army of traitors, Ninaean sat in Tharbad and did nothing. He sat and let Dunlendings die, and then had the audacity to proclaim that they died because they were weak. He had sent an army to assist them at first, but then issued new orders to not aid the city. He abandoned the defenders to their death. When Aragorn came out of the north at the outset of this war, Ninaean fled from Beirig and abandoned the city to the coming army. When the then chieftain Yagthak learnt that Ninaean had fled, it was said he tore Ninaean's house down brick by brick with his bare hands before falling in defence of the city. A true hero. Were it not for the power of the White Hand and the decree that was issued by his messengers, the people would not have taken Ninaean as chieftain. But here we are. Led by a fool, at the whims of a mad wizard. Gundur spat again in disgust. The outrider had now reached the column of guards beneath Gundur's position, and Ninaean had arrived to take the message. From his lofty post, Gundur couldn't hear much, but what he did hear hit him like a stone. The enemy is at the walls of Kaloniak. Gundur felt his knees shaking and his heart beating faster and faster. He had avoided the ravages of the so-called Free Peoples until now. He had been posted to the watch at Tharbad shortly after the ruined city was retaken, and he had not yet had a chance to meet the enemy on the field. Now, it would seem, he wouldn't get that chance, as the enemy would soon be at his own door. Kaloniak was but a short ride north, and the castle had been given a paltry defence. Yes, the invaders would make short work of that place, and be before Tharbad's walls long before help could come up from the south. Gundur was ready to meet the enemy. He was ready to fight in the name of his brothers and sisters who had been cut down mercilessly by the coming invaders. He was ready to fight and die for his beloved Dunland, but he knew that despite the rhetoric spouted by the heralds of Ninaean, Dunland had already lost. Beirig was now in the hands of the goblins. Dunyard was held by the filthy fishermen of the west, and Dunlarac had been burnt to the ground. Dunland had lost. He was ready to die for Dunland if it would secure a future for his people. But this, dying in defence of this ruinous place, far from Dunland, and dying in defence of that pathetic excuse of a man. He couldn't do it. He would not do it. He returned to his post and looked long over the people beneath him. He looked over the marshes to the east and the long arm of the river running west. He looked at the ruins of Tharbad and the rickety bridge across the river, in poor imitation of the stone bridge that now sat on the river bed. He looked away east, to the high peaks of the mountains, and a gentle breeze brushed against his face. The faint scent of pine caught in his nostrils, and his decision was made. He waited until the fanfare had died away and the outrider, guards, and chieftain had all returned to the city. Gundur was once again alone, on guard outside the city, guarding what he thought, guarding nothing but a dying dream, a fool's dream. He picked up the small pack behind him and clambered down the tower. At the base he gave a quick look to the makeshift walkways on the walls behind him. All was clear. With his heart beating almost out of his chest, he saw his chance, and sprinting at full pace, he beelined for a small thicket just beyond the site of the watchtower and away from the road. He knew he would likely be seen, but there was no archer in Dunland that could fire clear across this gap at a moving target, and none likely to try it anyway. What is one more traitor to them, he thought. Traitor. As he thought it, he almost pulled up. The word tasted wrong on his tongue and in his mind. Would he really be a traitor? He stopped, suddenly, on the open field, paralyzed at the thought. He wasn't a traitor, he thought to himself. A traitor betrays his people. A traitor puts thought of himself above his country. A traitor cares nothing for his kin. Gundur was no traitor. Gundur was devoted to Dunland. He believed in the power of the land and the people who lived there. What he did for Dunland. After what seemed like an age, Gundur began to run again, and as he ran he could hear shouts and cries from the walls behind him. He hit the tree line and did not stop running. Deeper and deeper into the woods he went. He would head northwest, he thought. He had heard that the rangers kept a watch over the Sarn Ford, and no Dunnish scout had yet come back from that place. That was his best hope now. Yes, he thought as he ran, I will happily die for Dunland, but not the Dunland that sits in Tharbad and barks orders at scared children. I will die for the Dunland that was, the Dunland that will be. I will die for a Dunland that has a future. Even if, for now, that Dunland must bow to the Dunedain. Gundur still could not believe what had become of him. When he ran for his life from the walls of Tharbad with thoughts of treachery, he didn't dream that he would end up sitting here. He thought, in the very best case, he might fight alongside the Dunedain to free his homeland from the puppets of Saruman, not be sitting here, in this grand chamber and with these men of renown. Gundur had fought alongside the Dunedain, of course, but not just any old one. Aragorn himself. He had ridden with the would-be king on his journey through Rohan to Gondor itself, and there the lowly Dunlending deserter had witnessed the crowning of the king. Shortly afterwards, Aragorn, and perhaps against better judgment, had made Gundur the Dunlending ambassador to the Reunited Kingdom. And so, against all the odds, here sat a Dunlending traitor as the ambassador for his people in the war council of the king. Gundur surveyed the room and immediately felt as though he did not belong, an impostor amongst the great. Denethor was there, of course, lost in thought as he always seemed to be, and either side of him sat his sons. Faramir had come to know the new king well, and they had begun a strong friendship, but Boromir was more reserved and looked upon Aragorn with a mix of hope and fear. Aragorn, of course, dominated the room, but there was another who almost stood to the same heights. A tall man from the south. He had striking grey eyes and deep dark hair, and he spoke with such authority that he made Gundur feel like a servant boy. Boromir and Faramir looked up to the man, but Denethor eyed him ever with suspicion. He was Imrahil, next in line to the Principality of Dol Amroth, and here representing his aging father in these discussions. As Gundur looked around at more faces he didn't know, proud men in a variety of different coloured robes and cloths, greens, blues, blacks and whites, He then caught eyes with one whom he knew well, and the anger within him grew. Sitting directly opposite him at the large wooden table sat a man of disgust, a pretender, a usurper, the enemy. It was inevitable, of course. The two nations had been firm friends for many hundreds of years, and Gundur knew he would have to treat with them eventually. But to be sitting so close to the king's nephew, his mind raced with many thoughts. He knew he couldn't do anything, of course. Not only was he now a statesman and had to protect Dunland's interests above his own, but he knew that Eomer, of all in the room, would cut him down in a very one-sided fight. Eomer met Gundur's stare for what seemed an age. But eventually, the low chatter in the room was broken by the measured voice of Gandalf the Grey. "We must now decide, together, how we deal with the threat of Mordor and the rising tide of darkness in Eriador." Denethor spoke first. "Eriador is not for my people to be concerned with. Mordor has claimed Caer Andros, and their armies outnumber ours to a hopeless degree. Your army of death may have claimed the river crossing at Osgiliath, Aragorn King. But how long will those oath-breakers truly follow your word?" Aragorn met his question. "They follow the rightful king of the realms in exile, Denethor, and they will follow me until I bid them not to. I have sent them to tie up the Dark Lord's forces at the walls of Minas Morgul. With their help, we can cleanse that place and clear the caverns beyond. We could march on the Dark Tower without needing to cross the threshold of the Black Gate." Boromir scoffed. "Have you seen the Black Land, my lord? Have you walked its paths and breathed its air? Getting into Mordor is less than half the battle. The very ground fights against you in that place. We would need an army to rival the days of the last alliance, and we do not have that strength." "Not to mention the threat coming up from the south," said Imrahil. "Our men have great power to hold the Athir, but I cannot say for how long. Without backing and reinforcement from Gondor, my people may be overwhelmed by the hatred of the Southrons and those misguided fools in Umbar." Aragorn turned to Imrahil. "Your people have fought well, and they will have the reinforcement they need. I will send Orodreth to support them with a company of Gondorians." Orodreth stood and saluted in support, and Imrahil nodded, seemingly appeased for now. Aragorn spoke again. "Using the twisting paths and narrow ridges of the Athir to our advantage, we can counter whatever numbers the enemy sends. Besides, my scouts inform me that the men of Khand recently put down two great powerful lords in the east, and now feel strong enough to take us alone." Gandalf winced at the words, and sadness swept over him. Few noticed, but Gundur did. Aragorn continued. "Their pride will be their downfall, as they have barred the traitors and Southrons from accessing the Athir. You fight one enemy, not three. Hold them, Imrahil. Hold them until we cleanse the Black Land. Then we will turn south once more together." Gundur, surprising even himself, then found that he was speaking. "What of Eriador, my lord? What of the assurances you made to my people in Dunland? Shall we fight alone on empty promises?" A low snigger made its way around the room, and Eomer smirked at Gundur. Aragorn silenced them with a raise of his hand. "I have made provision for your people, Gundur. Imrahil has agreed to sail a fleet up the Gwathlo and land at Tharbat. We will sweep your puppet king from his throne and save your people from Isengard." At that moment the door swung wide, and a messenger came running forward. Aragorn bid him speak for the group, for this was a war council. "The clansmen of Enedwaith," he said, "have broken their agreement. They have attacked our merchant caravans passing through Londere, and worse, my lord, they have declared war on the men of Bree." After a silence, Eomer spoke. "Why should we be concerned with a flea-ridden rabble from the back end of nowhere? They haven't the strength to press us, and my scouts report that they've been waging war on Isengard's western border. They cannot possibly hope to hold two fronts." Denethor nodded in agreement and added, "And so what of the Bree land? The people there are little better than peasants. They hold no power, no strength. They should not distract us from our goal. Sauron must be destroyed." Gandalf and Aragorn shared a brief, distressing glance, and Gandalf stood. "There is more to the Bree land than simple folk and simple means. There is," he hesitated, "a strength in the Bree land that we must use to our advantage. If the Bree land and the Shire fall, then our hope in this war fails." Aragorn stood. "I will not abandon the people I have protected for much of my life. My predecessors made a vow that we would not let fall the folk of Bree and the Shire to the enemies that surround them. Duinhir, you are to take the western companies and march north. Avoid war in Enedwaith proper and aim to rendezvous with Imrahil's fleet at Tharbad. Dunland is to be defeated, but do not, at any cost, allow the Shire to fall to the clansmen or the coming storm from the north." Eomer raised an eyebrow. "Storm in the north, my lord?" "Yes," Aragorn said despondently. "Angmar comes again." Gundur could not bring himself to break the silence. The room had been sitting, waiting, for any word or gesture from the king, but none came, and they sat and they waited. Gundur had nodded to the men around the table, save for Eomer, when he came in, but no word had passed anybody's lips as yet. Aragorn sat motionless in the great chair at the head of the table. His gaze was firm, but his posture and drawn face betrayed him. He was tired, deathly tired. Gundur couldn't help but pity the man. Such a weight sat on those shoulders, and where before that weight was supported by optimism and courage, now the reality of war had clearly taken its toll. Knowing that he must speak, and dreading it anyway, Gundur stood. "My king!" Aragorn didn't move, but his eyes shot to Gundur. The stare nearly paralyzed the Dunlending, but he pressed on. "My king, I must bring news of the war in Dunland." More than one exasperated breath met his words, but Gundur stood firm. "I have received a fresh report from my network in the hills, and the situation— It doesn't matter," cried Denethor, banging his fist on the table as he stood. "It doesn't matter what happens to the people of Dunland now, Gundur. The war is here, in Gondor, and as your network seems to have not reported the obvious to you, the war goes ill." Denethor turned to the king, and Aragorn glanced over the old man, but didn't meet his eyes. "What is my king going to do about it? Your plan has clearly not worked. Sauron has not taken the bait, and now thousands of orcs are camped just across the river, poised to take Osgiliath and flood the Pelennor. What strength we did have has been squandered and wasted, and now we sit here defenseless." "We are not defenseless, brother," said Imrahil in a measured voice. "My people have now beaten back the forces of Khand at every turn. At the crossing, Orodreth has performed with excellence, and my men speak very highly of him." Denethor nearly spat in reply. "Your people have to fight flea-ridden nomads. Sheep herders and children is all that makes the Khandish army, and you stand and say the battle is hard fought? When the Swan has fought the Shadow, then you may claim the glory, brother. But until then, do not tell us tales of your fights with the peasant folk." Eomer spoke. "You speak of the men of Khand as children, yet, as children, they were learning to master the saddle. It is no small feat to push back the horse archers of Khand, and I'd wager that your precious footmen would do little when the storm of Khand breaks upon Gondorian shores. We owe our current safety to the knights of Dol Amroth." Boromir sneered. "A surprise to no one at this table that you should stand with the Swan, Eomer. Might we have some advice for the king from you that is actually impartial?" "My advice is given as I see fit, and on my reading of the events, Boromir. The fact remains that the men of Khand can only be held in check by stout horsemen, and Dol Amroth provides where my people cannot." Denethor leaned over to Eomer, and in a soft voice, almost whispered, "We know exactly what Dol Amroth provides to you, Eomer." Eomer threw his goblet at the man, and a fury took him. "My private dealings are my own, you old fool. You do not have the right to speak to me of personal matters." Imrahil stood sharply and brought his fist onto the table. "My daughter's relationship with Eomer is well known. The king and I bless this union, and it is not for you to speak of such matters, Denethor. Control yourself." "Union," the king muttered under his breath, and the room fell silent again. "This union will be the end of us all. I cannot hold back the forces of Angmar, of Isengard, of Khand, and of Mordor. You speak of the deaths of your people, Denethor, but my people are on the brink of extinction." His voice began to tremble, yet rise. "Sauron has taken the bait, I say. His armies camp not in anticipation of invasion, but in desperate hope to contain the dead. Have I not shut the Black Gate to his forces? Have I not cleansed southern Ithilien, and now surround the last bastion of our enemy there? You would do well to understand the bigger picture in this. Mordor is contained for now, and Éomer and I work to bring down the influence of the White Hand. There is more at stake than your pampered lives here in Gondor. We fight across all of Middle-earth, and I need people by me who understand that. People who stand by Gondor. People who have not lost hope. People who do not seek answers from unlikely places. Excuse yourself, Denethor. Denethor couldn't contain his surprise, and he stumbled back from his chair. Spying on your own advisors now, my king, Denethor answered. I am steward of this realm, and I will do what is necessary to safeguard its future. You cannot dismiss me from this chamber. Aragorn stood, and Gundur was stunned. The tired, withered man who had been slumped in the chair had gone, and here, before him now, stood a majestic king. I am king of this reunited kingdom. I am the descendant of Númenor, and the peoples of old Arnor and Gondor follow my command. And, by my right as king, I strip from you the title of steward, Denethor. I know of your dealings. I know of your misguided plan, and I will not let Gondor fall from within. You are banished from this city henceforth. Yes, the Palantir will be well beyond your reach. Boromir stood in shock. You cannot banish him. He fights for the people just as you do. Gondor will not allow it, Aragorn replied. He does not fight for our people by trying to broker deals with Sauron himself. A stunned silence once again descended on the room, and at length Boromir spoke again. Father, is it true what he says? Denethor looked hard at Boromir but said nothing, and the younger sank into his chair, head in his hands. Aragorn raised his hand, and 2 men of the fountain came into the room, and Denethor was taken from the chamber. Boromir, Aragorn said, turning to the man. Your father held good intentions, but he has become lost along the way. Sauron has learned much from Denethor and has played him well. Your father thought to trick the great deceiver, but man cannot fight with Sauron in a game of minds. Our people know this all too well, but your father had lost hope. Boromir, it is people like you I need beside me, those who fight on whatever the hope and whatever the cost. You have defended Osgiliath and held the men together in the face of thousands of orcs. You have fought against a Nazgul and covered the retreat of your men in the face of hopeless odds. You understand the needs of the people more so than your father ever could. Boromir, stand. Imrahil, knowing the king's intent, had moved up to his side and bore the scepter of the steward of Gondor. Aragorn took it from him and held it before the young Gondorian. Boromir's face was twisted with a mess of emotions. He stared long into the eyes of his king, but presently he took the scepter. I will not abandon hope as my father has done, and I will lead the people of Gondor in your name. I accept. Gundur, feeling the enormity of the moment, stood and began to clap, and one by one the captains of Gondor each stood around the table, clapped with him, and the room began to chant his name. Amidst the clamour, the doors to the chamber suddenly burst open, and Gundur was stunned by the shining brilliance of the light that then filled each corner of the room. As the light began to fade, Gundur saw the shape of a man step over the breach. He hadn't seen anything like him. The man wore armour of the finest craftsmanship. It seemed wrought of gold and bore the design of a great gilded flower. The man's hair was long and hung freely down his back. It too shone with brilliance, and at times seemed silver, and at times gold. He carried a shield, and upon its face was an image of the sun, with rays casting out to the edges. He glided over the stone floor of the chamber, and Gundur felt his heart lift at the mere sight of the man. But as he moved further into the room, Gondor realized he was no man at all, but an elf. His face was pure and fair, and his vibrant eyes were piercing. Aragorn had said nothing, and simply beamed at the elf, seemingly waiting on the stranger to speak. The newcomer met the stares of everyone around the room and gave a warm smile to each, and at length he introduced himself. I am Glorfindel, of the House of the Golden Flower. I am sent from Rivendell at the behest of my lords Elrond and Olorin." More than one eyebrow was raised around the room, and whispers passed from man to man. Gandalf. "The enemy coming down from the north. An enemy I know all too well." He gave a knowing glance to Aragorn. "The Angmaren," he continued, "have suffered a devastating defeat at the crossings of the Mythythel. And there is more. The army from Dol Amroth has now landed upon the Gwathlo, and has dealt a crushing blow to the traitors of Dunland. I am, however, not here as a messenger. I am here as an ally. My people will not abandon Middle-earth to the fate of Sauron. We will fight. Let elf and man stand together again as we did in days of old, and let our enemies tremble, as the banners of Númenor and Gil-galad King sweep across Middle-earth once more." Gundur looked out from the high windows of the tall black tower and felt content. The familiarity of the sights and smells that drifted in on the breeze warmed him. He smiled and returned to the desk behind him. Sitting down, the weight of current events returned to his shoulders, and the brief moment of peace was broken again. Dunland, as King Aragorn had promised, had indeed been defeated, but where it was hallowed as a victory, it was, in truth, a betrayal in all but name. Aragorn had given the lands of Gundur's people to the filthy rabble from Ennard Wyth, weak-willed fisherfolk who could barely string a sentence together, let alone rule a nation-state. The remaining men of Dunland, true sons all, now had to work and serve in the name of these new masters. Aragorn had replaced one power-hungry madman with another, and Gundur's hand began to shake with rage as he thought more and more on this. The only consolation in this mess was the capture and cleansing of the Orthanc, the tower within which Gundur now sat. The White Wizard had escaped the sacking, and his whereabouts were unknown, but without the deep pits of the Orthanc, the White Hand wilted. This, at least, gave comfort to Gundur, for he knew his people were no longer being used as pawns, as arrow fodder, in the lines of Isengard's armies. After a time, deep in thought, Gundur was summoned to the central chamber. He had come to dread these meetings by now. They often descended into political game-playing, the lesser lords of the land vying for any scrap that Aragorn might throw their way. The high-spirited mood of cooperation that was commonplace after the coronation had been lost. Reluctantly, Gundur made his way to the chamber. He was the last to arrive, and scanned the room to make out the belligerents in today's war of words. Aragorn, of course, sat on a raised plinth at the head of a long, black-stoned table. His mood was almost always one of resolve. For all the promises he may have broken, and the lack of thought he gave to the lesser folk, he still stood higher than any man in the room, and carried himself well. Gundur, begrudgingly, liked the man. Sitting next to Aragorn was the golden-haired elf of Gondolin. Glorfindel had swiftly become chief advisor to the king, and continued to represent the interests of the remaining Noldor in Middle-earth. However, for all of their outward unity, tensions had crept in. Glorfindel was adamant a fleet of Ardenaim ships was moving on Mithlond, but Aragorn had openly declared the returning Black Númenóreans as friends of the king, and dismissed Glorfindel's rumours. On the king's other side sat Adrihil and Éomer. Deep in conversation, they were discussing some riding technique or some such. Gundur cared little for these two, and eyed them ever with suspicion. Boromir and Faramir were there also, and now, as the council had relocated to Isengard, Dunedain also sat about the table. Their chief spokesman was Halbarad, a tall man of few words who seemed to always speak to the heart of the matter. Gundur admired him for his no-nonsense words, and wished there were more like him. Stretching away down the table then sat the lesser lords, rulers of the fiefs or allies of the new kingdom. Gruff men from the north sat beside the fat merchants of Bree. Aragorn stood. "Gentlemen, please stand with me and raise your glasses in honour of Adrihil, Prince of Dol Amroth, and Hannon, Conqueror of Dun Larach. Through their efforts, we are able to sit in this tower on a mountain of victories." The room echoed their names, and a cheer followed afterward. Some good news for a change, Gundur thought, was just what they needed. Hannon has managed to put down the Dunlending rebellions once and for all, and has engineered further peace with the men of Enid Wythe. A moment's respite in the midst of this all-encompassing storm. Many heads nodded at the words, and the men drank. Now we must turn our attention at last to the north, east, and south. The royal treasury has recovered. We have the coin to outfit companies where we choose. Mordor's holdings outside of the mountains have fallen, and now we man the passes of Cirith Ungol and Udun. These victories do not belong to just me, and I would hear you all speak on the future of the kingdom. Adriel spoke first. "My king, I know there are many here who would say that we must now invade the Black Land, but I think this is folly. Our armies can hold the passes, but if we advance, Sauron can dig in and make us pay for every inch. I say we leave him to rot and press our advantage over the south. The men of Khand grow more bold with each new attack, and my men are suffering in a war of attrition. They have had no reinforcements now for many seasons, and the bridges of Lynn here cannot hold them back forever." Faramir stood next and spoke, a rare occurrence when the brothers were present together. "My thought is with my kin, my lord. My scouts have punctured deep into Horondor, and my fears of a Southron incursion have proved true. An army from Harad has crossed Khandish lines, unchecked, and now marches on the mouths. The south will be overrun if we do not support our allies there." Glorfindel winced, and for a moment Gundur noticed the unmoving, emotionless facade he wore fell away to reveal the anger beneath. Eomer spoke next. "I too agree, my king. Between us, Adrihil and I can remove the last stain of the White Hand, and can then turn our attention to the border with Enid Wythe. I have also sent diplomats north to parley with the Easterlings who hold sway over the Orcs of Mirkwood, and, on your command, I believe I can seek a peace with them." A man farther down the table stood next. Gundur did not recognize him, but from his cloth he was a man of the north. "My king, I am honored to have been invited to your table, and would speak on what your Rohirrim has spoken of." Aragorn nodded. "My people have noticed a change in the Orcs of Mirkwood. It is my belief that the forces of the Shadow are waiting. I think they know Sauron will soon be defeated, and, like rats from the ship, they are seeking to stay alive in a world without him. You will find that Dol Guldur will seek peace. The north is quiet." Halbarad spoke next. "The north is not as quiet as you may wish it to be, Dalesman. At least not all of it. Aragorn, the Angmarim attacks grow stronger by the day, and the men of Bree cannot withstand the onslaught from north and south. Our people are safe, and Gandalf has done much to muster the northern defenders. Hannon holds the crossings of Tharbad with a strong garrison, but the Enid Wythrim come across the Gwathlo by their own means. Angmar will break upon Amun Sul, but I fear Bree will not weather the storm. Their people He paused and glanced down at the men from Bree. There was a haunting look in their eyes. He turned back with a sigh. "Their people are not ready." One of the Breelanders stood. He was old, and his body creaked as much as the chair he stood from. "Halbarad is right, my king. My people are stout-hearted, and despite what these Gondorians and Rohirrim might think of us, we will fight to the last. But our last are already stepping up to the battle line. We need help." "And you shall have it," said Aragorn as he rose to meet the gaze of the Breelander. "Dispatch riders immediately. Let the world of the Shadow now quake as the strength of the kingdom turns its gaze on them. To war." Gundur looked up at the flags flying high above him, and could not help but smile at seeing such vivid colours stand out against the dismal backdrop of Mordor. The ground was cracked, and deep fissures ran criss-cross on the plain before him. Away in the distance, the fires of Orodruin spluttered intermittently. The great mountain, it seemed, never slept. He turned away from the Black Land and looked back at the flags of the Alliance fluttering on the breeze. Carefree and proud they seemed. Largest of all the arrayed standards was the newly commissioned banner of the Reunited Kingdom, and the great white tree, emblazoned in the centre, shone like a beacon in this dark place. He thought of Sauron, seated always as he was at the height of Barad-dûr, and Gundur hoped that he could see the standards on the hill here before the Morgul Pass. He hoped this small display of defiance would fill the hearts of the countless orcs out on the plain with dread. Sauron's days were drawing to an end. Gundur was then called into the large tent at the base of the flag display, and he trotted over with pleasure. The mood in the tent did not reflect the darkness of the land about it. There was much to celebrate, and all here knew it. Aragorn spoke immediately. "My lords, messengers from Fen-Gedor have just arrived, and I have more good news to share. 3 more Nazgûl have been sent back into the tower, and Hurin tells of a victory over some 4,500 orcs." A cheer erupted around the tent, and Gundur beat his chest in approval. "By my count," shouted Aragorn over the din, "that makes 4 of the ringwraiths sent back to the tower." Aragorn turned as if speaking to the mouth of the tent. "Where are the other 5? Bring them to us. We are not finished yet," he cried, and with the last word he threw the helmet of the Witch King onto the table, and another cheer roared from the gathered men. "Sons of Gondor, Rohan and Arnor, my brothers, I have seen this day that the strength Sauron believes has left the world of men is rekindled and burning as bright as in the days of Elendil, the days of my forefathers. We have achieved that which none thought possible. The great gate of Fen-Gedor is ours, and the garrison set against any attempt by the orcs to break free. We hold Minas Ithil again, and have used the orcs' stupidity to lure many of them to their deaths here. The passes are ours, the river is ours, and the enemy, though numerous, cannot hope to break free from the walls now closing in around them." Gundur looked around the room as the men cheered once more, and noted that only one in the company did not share in the exuberance of the king, one whom Gundur had not seen before. The man was seated where others stood. He wore a heavy mail suit beneath deep crimson and black robes, but it was the helmet that caught Gundur's eye. It looked like an imitation of the great helms of the Fountain Guard, but where they had swan feathers, the wings of this helmet were wrought of metal, flowing back away from the face rather than to the sides. The metal seemed at first to be black, but as the man turned to look at Gundur, the colouring seemed to flicker, and there was a green hue there. The man held a grim expression, and he locked his stare on Gundur. He slowly shook his head as he stood, gathering something from the floor as he did so. He towered over the Rohirrim that stood before him, and Gundur could not help but notice the pride resonating from the man, and settled on only one conclusion: royalty. The stranger took a step forward and abruptly cut into the cheering. "You speak of victory. You have closed the door on the darkness, but that does not keep it at bay. Are your people so foolish as to not understand what comes?" "How dare you speak to the king with such disrespect?" cried Éomer, ever ready to stand beside Aragorn. The stranger looked down at the Rohirric prince with a cursory glance before fixing his gaze back on Aragorn. "I speak not to my king, but to yours, and I would speak my mind to any who is so careless with the lives of the sons of Númenor." Aragorn sighed and raised his hand, bidding Éomer stand down. "It's okay, Éomer. Gimmelzor has the interests of our people at heart, and his ways are not our own. Friends," said Aragorn, addressing the room, "I present Gimmelzor, son of Gimmelcad." Aragorn hesitated on the second name, but Gundur did not know why. The king continued, "and newly come representative of our allies in the south, our brothers." Gimmelzor strode forward and stood before the room, looking at each person in turn. Gundur could easily see the contempt with which this man held the occupants of the tent, and Gimmelzor spoke again. "You speak of victory, here on the borders of Mordor, but I have seen into the abyss before you. I have walked the paths of Mordor. I have climbed the steps of the Dark Tower, but more so than that, I have seen what horrors await you from the vastness of Nirn. Your army here is ill prepared for what comes. Even now, as you toast your glory and shore up the defences of the Morgul Pass, these things are massing for war, and will be unleashed upon you. At his last word, Gimmelzor threw back his cloak, revealing a giant tusk. He swung it onto the table before him, and it broke through to the floor. The thing was almost as big as the man who had carried it. The men stared in disbelief. At length, Glorfindel broke the silence. "This cannot be. These creatures were put down by the last alliance. The elves scoured the plains and cleansed them of these monsters." "Not all," replied Gimmelzor. "I have seen them with my own eyes. I have seen the orcs command them, and seen the ferocity they bring to the field. They are coming." Quizzical looks went back and forth between the men. Eventually they all looked to Aragorn. The king stood to speak, but as he did, a tremor shook the room. Aragorn darted out of the tent, and Gundur followed. He looked out on the horizon, but could see nothing. Suddenly, an almighty boom, like the beating of 1,000 drums, hit the gathered men, and the ground began to shake around them. Aragorn, undaunted, handed a javelin to Gundur. "You'll need this." Gundur sat motionless in the small, makeshift command tent of the Dunedain army. The cacophony of death and destruction beyond the tent barely registered in his mind, and he just sat and stared. There were 2 others with him, but none spoke. The air in that place was as heavy as the mood. Just then the tent flap burst open, and the 3 men were roused from their stupor by the assault on their senses from the man that entered. He did not yet speak, but took a moment to catch his breath and wipe the worst of the orc filth from his sword and shield. Gundur looked over the tall man standing before him, and he could see the lines of concern on his face. He saw through the facade of command and strength that the man wore. The newcomer was first to break the silence, and in a low voice he murmured, "The orcs are routed completely. I have posted sentries at each gate. The camp is ours, for now." He took a seat at the head of the small table in the center of the tent and began to pore over the maps and pictograms before him, each symbol denoting enemy troop movements and army types. Gundur had looked over the same maps already. He had spoken with the scouts as well, and he knew what all 4 men in that tent now knew. The expedition was doomed. "We have to get him back." The voice that spoke was hoarse and broken, and the man that carried it looked no better. Faramir raised his head and looked at each man in the tent. "We cannot leave his body here in this accursed place. Not to those beasts baying at the door." "What would you have me do, brother?" said Boromir from the head of the table. "Have you been out amongst the men? There is no fight left in them. Their hope, their courage, it's gone. Died with the king. We make north then. Push the men for Feng'Gador. We have to get back to Gondor and let the people know of his sacrifice. We owe it to his memory to ensure he does not rot in a pit in Gorgoroth. We have to try, Boromir." "Faramir is right," spoke Heirluin from the far side of the tent. Gundur had not known Heirluin long, as the man had been in western Gondor until only recently. He was a tall man and very fair. He wore deep green robes that stood him and his men apart from the black and white of the rank and file. His command of his cavalry had earned him great respect, and Gundur was thankful to have him here. "We cannot sit here crying over what might have been like widows in the wake of a war. Aragorn must be returned to Minas Tirith, and we owe it to his faithful out there to try and get each one of them home. They all followed our king because they believed in his message. They believed in the peace that he promised, and it is now our duty to ensure they do not pay for that longing hope." Boromir stood and nodded. "So we shall," he said resolutely. "Faramir, send your scouts north immediately. I want a path picked through the plain right to the foot of Feng'Gador. Heirluin, have your men stir the rest of the camp. The green colours of Pinnith-Gelin distinguish themselves, and the men look up to yours. Go about the camp and rally them as best you can. And Gundur, prepare the king's procession. I will make word that you are in charge of the king's entourage, and I will see that no man hinders you. Whatever happens, You must get the king back to Minas Tirith." Word of the plan spread quickly among the men, and the sombre camp came to life in a flurry. As commanded, the green colours of Pnyth could be seen all over the camp, with their banners caught in the smoke-filled breeze, standing defiant against the backdrop of smog. Gundur prepared a great cart to haul the king's coffin, and the remaining men of the Grey Company took up the guard, standing as great stones in the maelstrom of the camp activity. After only a short time, the army of the king was arrayed on the plain to the north of the camp. Gundur and his company was at their head, and Boromir climbed atop the cart with the banner of the king in his hand. He unfurled the mighty banner, and silence fell upon the gathered men. "Gondorians, Arnorians, brothers, I am under no illusion. I am not your king. I cannot stand here and muster you in the courage and strength that he could. I cannot lead you into the very flames of Angband and sing songs of our glory whilst we go, but I can lead you out. That is what I intend to do. I will not allow the memory of my king to be sullied by the filth of Mordor. I will not allow his body to be hewn and defiled by the beasts of this desolate place, and I will not stand idly by and let his men die whilst there is breath in my lungs. I have fought alongside each and every one of you, and I know that you will not allow this either. So gather your strength and gather your courage, for today we march north. We march not just for ourselves, but for every man, woman, and child in Gondor and in the north. We march to ensure that Aragorn's legacy continues. We march in defiance of Sauron's would-be victory, and most of all, we march for the freedom of our people." A great cheer erupted from the men at Boromir's words. He nodded to Heir Luin and seated away to the left, and the company of Pnyth gave each a long, clear blast of their horns. As the echo of the horns died down, Boromir raised the horn of Gondor to his lips and blew. The sound was like none the men had ever heard, and the fire was rekindled in their hearts. Boromir turned and raised his sword arm to the north. Gundur gave a crack of the reins, and the army of King Aragorn began its slow march north. The march home. As the caravan of diplomats and merchants approached the rickety bridge, Gundur cocked his head to the sky and let his lungs fill with the sweet mountain air. It had been a long time since he had tasted the sweet scent of the pines, the scent of home. He threw his arms back and let the welcoming feeling wash over him. His journey had taken him to the farthest reaches of the world he had known and elevated him to heights he hadn't thought possible, but now it was finally over, and now he was going home. It had been some 5 months since the great battle at Helm's Deep. The wizard had been overthrown, and the reunited kingdom finally stamped its authority on Middle-earth. One by one, the enemies of the kingdom began to sue for peace, and only a few far-flung fools still fought the great power. Gundur had stayed in Helm's Deep, and at the request of High King Eldarion had begun the difficult process of opening talks between Dunland and Rohan. One, the client kingdom of a great power, and the other, its ally. Gundur had laid the groundwork of peace for his people, but he had felt his age in the halls of the Hornburg. The Rohirric diplomats were fresh-faced. They were young. A smart move on Eomer's part, Gundur thought. These men would not have the same grievances toward Dunland that men his age harboured against the Horse Lords, and vice versa. Their fathers undoubtedly told them tales of the barbarity of the Dunlendings, but they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The age of these men only served to make Gundur realize that the future they were discussing was not a future that he would have a part in. And so, after only 2 days into the talks, he resolved to step down from his post as ambassador of his people. He had presented his request to Adrihil, who, after the great defence of Barad and Ed, had been granted the honour of the king's voice, and could therefore speak on his behalf. Adrian had looked over Gundur with a deep, knowing look, and the two men shared a brief moment of brotherhood as they each acknowledged their fading mark on Middle-earth. With his request granted, Gundur and a small company of Dunlendings made their march north, with the wagon trains of merchants and diplomats. They would pass Dunland proper and head to Tharbad. The city had been reclaimed by the kingdom shortly after the Hornburg fell, and Eldarion had given the important city to the newly established fiefdom of Dunland. The Danish people still saw Beirig as their capital, but with the trade and footfall that now flowed across the Gwathlo, Tharbad had become their chief city, and it was there that Gundur would officially appoint his successor. As Gundur's caravan crossed the rickety makeshift bridge at Tharbad, he was suddenly struck by a feeling. He couldn't place it at first. Was it hope? Elation? No, fear. Fear and opportunity. It was only a fleeting feeling, and he searched his surround for the cause, and there he saw it. Standing before him, on the north bank of the Gwathlo, stood a single, solitary tower. A simple structure it was, made to overlook the north road out of the city. At its height stood a watchman. Gundur turned to look away from the tower, and across the road was a small thicket of trees. He walked to the base of the tower and looked up at the walls of Tharbad, and he laughed. The sight line is still blocked, he thought to himself.